The year was 1782. Across Europe, philosophers preached reason, poets sang of liberty, and revolution was beginning to stir in the hearts of nations. The Enlightenment was supposed to have burned away the darkness, and yet, beneath the shadow of the Swiss Alps, an executioner raised his sword. The crowd pressed closer, their breath misting in the cold morning air. On her knees before him was a woman in a simple dress, her hands bound, her eyes fixed not on the blade, but on the sky. Her name was Anna Göldi. She was not a witch. She did not summon storms or speak with demons. She was a servant, a mother, a human being whose greatest crime was to live in a place where fear still had sharper edges than truth. In Paris, Voltaire was writing of tolerance. In Philadelphia, a new nation had declared that all men were created equal. But here, in the Protestant canton of Glarus, the old world still ruled. The world where a woman's word was worth nothing, where superstition could masquerade as law, and where the power of men could decide whether you lived or died. The charge was witchcraft. The proof? A sick child, a handful of sewing needles. Whispers that grew into accusations, and accusations that hardened into a verdict long before the trial began. When the sword fell that day, it did more than sever a life. It marked the final legal witch execution in European history, a brutal punctuation mark at the end of 3 centuries of blood and fire, of women burned, drowned, and beheaded in the name of purity. This is not just the story of Anna Göldi. It is the story of how fear survives even in the age of reason, and how injustice wears the mask of righteousness right up until the blade comes down. Part 1. The servant in the doctor's house. She arrived in Glarus with little more than the clothes on her back and the weight of a life already scored by loss. The road from her birthplace to this alpine town was long and cold, both in distance and in spirit. Born around 1734, in the hard season when frost claimed more crops than hunger could spare, Anna Göldi knew the smell of want before she could spell her own name. By the time she reached her middle years, the ledger of her life was written in scarcity. She had a child, bright-eyed, fragile, dependent, and no husband to stand between them and the world's cruelty. There was no inheritance, no land, no gold, only her own hands, her own back, her own willingness to work until her bones ached. The world she walked into was not built for women like her. In the eyes of the law, she was less than a person. In the eyes of society, a warning, a living proof of what befalls a woman without a man to define her. Her worth could be measured in how silently she served, how well she kept her head down. When the offer came to serve in the home of Dr. Johann Jakob Tschudi, it seemed a blessing. A physician, educated, respected. He was a man of influence in Glarus. His name carried weight in the church pews, in the council chambers, and at the market stalls. His wife, Anna Barbara, commanded the household like a captain at sea. Her word was order, her approval rare as spring after a long winter. Their daughter, small and bright, was the crown jewel of the family, her future guarded like a locked chest of silver. The house itself sat firm against the mountain wind, a place of neat windows and a roof that never leaked. Inside, the air was a mixture of boiled linen, medicinal herbs, and the faint metallic tang of surgical tools polished to a cold gleam. The kitchen, Anna's kingdom, was small but alive. The hiss of the kettle, the creak of the bread oven, the steady rhythm of the pestle grinding herbs. Her days unfolded in cycles as precise as clockwork: rise before the sun, stoke the fires until they roared, scrub the floors until the boards were pale as bone, haul water from the well, its surface often frozen into glass, wash, mend, chop, stir, each task done with care. For in such houses, mistakes were not forgiven, they were remembered. Anna carried herself quietly, moving through rooms like a shadow. She spoke when spoken to, kept her eyes lowered when the doctor's friends visited. She had learned the art of existing without leaving a trace. But in a place as small as Glarus, invisibility is an illusion. The town was a web of watchful eyes and long memories. A neighbor's frown could become a rumor by sundown. A servant's misstep could outlive the servant herself. Every gesture was weighed, every word sifted for meaning, every accident filed away like evidence for a trial yet to come. And the Göldi home, polished though it appeared, was not immune to the hairline fractures that run through all families. Pride is heavy, and even the strongest beams groan under its weight. From the outside, the household seemed secure. Inside, it was a glass case, transparent, brittle, one sharp tap away from shattering. Anna could not see the cracks yet. She could not know that she was already standing on a fault line, one that ran not through the stone of the Alps, but through the hearts of the people around her. A single breath, a single moment, and the ground would give way, plunging her into a darkness the Enlightenment's bright philosophies would never reach. Part 2. The Strange Illness and the Needle in the Meal. It began without warning, like a shadow creeping across a sunny room. The Göldi daughter, once a whirlwind of giggles and skipping feet, grew quiet. At first, it was subtle. The pallor in her cheeks, the way her eyes seemed heavier, her laughter slower to arrive. She began spending afternoons in bed, her small hands clutching the blanket as though holding on to something unseen. Then the fits began. Her limbs would seize, jerking with a violence that frightened even the family dog. Her back would arch, her eyes roll until only the whites showed. The sound of her teeth grinding echoed down the hallways, drowning out the frantic prayers murmured by her mother. Dr. Göldi, educated, respected, a man whose shelves were lined with Latin texts, stood helpless at her bedside. He examined her pulse, her tongue, the whites of her eyes, searching for signs the books might explain, but the books had no answers. And when knowledge fails, fear takes the throne. The first whispers began in the kitchen, in the space between the hiss of the kettle and the scrape of the bread knife. The scullery maid leaned toward the washerwoman. "It's not natural," the washerwoman told the stable boy. The stable boy told a neighbor. By nightfall, the town had begun to speak the old words again. Words pulled from centuries past. Curses, hexes, the evil eye. Old stories, usually kept tucked away like heirlooms too dangerous to touch, began to spill into daylight. Stories of bread laced with powders, of unseen hands stirring misfortune into milk, of invisible malice slipping through a household like smoke. And then, one evening, the horror took tangible form. The family was at table when the child, pale but hungry, tore into a piece of bread. Her face twisted, not in illness this time, but in pain. The loaf was broken open, and there, buried in the soft white, was a needle. It was thin, sharp, gleaming in the candlelight. A single needle might have been a terrible accident. But then there was another, and another, enough to erase the possibility of chance. The household froze, eyes turned instinctively, inevitably, toward the kitchen. In a house where the servant prepared the meals, suspicion had a straight and narrow path. It needed no investigation, no evidence beyond proximity. It only needed a direction to point its finger. And Anna Göldi, poor, unmarried, without family or influence, was the perfect target. She was not just an outsider, she was defenseless. The needles were passed from hand to hand, each touch adding weight to the story. By the time they left the Göldi house and entered the mouths of neighbors, they had multiplied into a tale sharper than steel, a witch's trick, an act of deliberate harm, proof of dark power. What might have been an unsolved household mystery in our age, fodder for a quiet police inquiry or a doctor's deeper search, became, in 1782, the seed of an accusation older than the Alps themselves. The verdict was already forming in people's minds long before it would be written in law. Anna's guilt was not to be proven, it was to be assumed. Part 3. The trial of a century's mistake. They called it justice. But the moment Anna was led through the heavy oak doors, she understood. It was not a trial. It was a burial. The grave had been dug long before she stepped inside, and this was merely the shoveling of the last earth upon her name. The chamber was cold, not from the winter air, but from the presence of men who saw themselves as instruments of God's will. Ink pots and parchments littered the long table, their shadows stretching under the flicker of candlelight. The smell was a mixture of damp wood, stale breath, and the metallic tang of quills scratching against paper. The judges sat elevated on a dais, as if the height could bring them closer to heaven. Their faces were carved with the same hardness as the mountains outside, unyielding, unmoved, untouched by doubt. Not one pair of eyes sought to understand her. They looked upon Anna not as a soul in peril, but as a problem already solved. Every word she spoke in her own defense fell into the void. Her denials were called proof of cunning. Her moments of composure rid as the mask of a practiced deceiver. Even the tremor in her hands was taken as the devil's grip tightening in her veins. The questions came like hammer blows, always the same, only sharper, heavier, more insistent with each repetition. Did you curse the child? Did you place the needles? Who gave you your powers? They did not bring out the rack or the whip. They did not need to. They worked with slower poisons, isolation in a dark cell, nights without sleep, food rationed to the point of weakness, and the ceaseless repetition of promises she knew were lies. Confess, and perhaps you will be spared. Days blurred into nights until time itself lost meaning. Her voice grew hoarse from denial. Her body, once steady, now swayed under its own weight. And when her strength finally broke, the words they had been waiting for spilled from her lips, not in truth, but in surrender. She told them she had practiced magic, that she had harmed the Göldi child, that she had done all the impossible, hateful things they accused her of. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, yet in that room it roared like the sound of nails sealing a coffin. The court clerk's quill drank in her fear, turning it into evidence. Lies became fact. Desperation became confession. And with each stroke of ink, the outcome was sealed tighter. By the time she fell silent, She could see it in their eyes. The sentence had not been decided in that moment. It had been written there from the start. Hannah Göldi would die, not because she was guilty, but because the story of her guilt was too perfect to let go. Part 4. The Death of the Last. June 13th, 1782. The sky above Glarus was a pale, indifferent blue, the kind of sky that watches without blinking, without caring. It made no promises. It offered no mercy. From the prison to the square, the road was lined with faces. Some watched in grim silence, their expressions locked behind the mask of custom. Others whispered to each other, their words curling in the cold air like smoke. There were those who looked at her with pity they dared not speak, and others whose eyes burned with the satisfaction of seeing evil destroyed. Anna walked with her hands bound in front of her, the rope coarse enough to scrape the skin raw. Her dress, simple, work-worn, was the same she had scrubbed floors in, now brushed clean, as though a tidy appearance could make the execution respectable. Each step was swallowed by the murmur of the crowd. She recognized faces. A woman whose laundry she had carried from the river. A man whose children she had bandaged after a fall. Neighbors who had seen her at the market, counting coins carefully before buying bread. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder, witnesses to her last minutes. The execution ground opened before her, a circle of trampled dirt. At its center waited the block, dark, worn, its surface grooved with the memory of other deaths. It stood like a mouth that had swallowed 100 lives before hers and would swallow more after. The executioner was there too, a tall man with the impassive bearing of someone who had long ago learned to silence his own conscience. The morning light caught the steel of his sword, and for a moment it flared like a shard of ice. They chose beheading, the officials had said, merciful. No fire, no stake, no slow death by smoke and heat, just steel and speed, as if the cleanliness of the act could wash away the blood that had already been spilled in words, in lies, in the breaking of her spirit. Anna stepped forward. The wood of the block smelled of rain that had long since dried and of old deaths that never would. She knelt without trembling. She did not cry. She did not beg. Her eyes moved beyond the ring of faces, beyond the gallows post, to the mountains, those ancient sentinels, white and eternal, whose silence had outlived kings and will outlive men like these. Perhaps she thought of her child, left to navigate a world that had just stolen their mother. Perhaps she thought of the long road that had led her here, each step paved by other people's fear. Or perhaps she thought of nothing at all. The executioner raised his blade. The air thickened, heavy with a heartbeat that seemed to echo across the square. For that one suspended instant, the world held its breath. Then the blade fell, swift, unhesitating, and Anna Göldi's body crumpled to the earth, her head severed clean. The crowd gasped, some stepping back as if the spray of blood could stain them with guilt. It was over. The murmurs began again, softer this time, as if even the most eager eyes could not watch death for long. The block was wiped down. The dirt drank the blood. The mountains said nothing. They kept her last breath folded into their shadow, as they had kept countless secrets before hers. And so, on that indifferent June morning, Europe's last legal witch execution came to pass. not with the roar of fire, but with the whisper of steel. Part 5. After the blade. The earth closed over her without ceremony. No priest stood to bless the grave. No consecrated ground received her. No stone carried her name. Only a patch of soil left unmarked where weeds would grow tall in the summer and blacken in the frost, untouched by flowers, untouched by love. The wind swept over it without pause, as if unwilling to remember. In the eyes of the authorities, Anna Göldi's memory was to be buried as deeply as her body. Erase the name, erase the shame. The Göldi child recovered soon after, and to the narrow minds of Glarus, that was proof enough. The witch was dead, the evil gone. Life returned to its rhythms, market days, church bells, the slow turning of the seasons, as though nothing had happened, except for the child Anna left behind, a child now motherless, marked by the invisible brand of scandal. The name Göldi became something people only whispered, as though saying it aloud might invite misfortune. But whispers travel. They slipped beyond the valleys, over the cold ridges of the Alps, riding on letters and the talk of merchants. Far away, in cities where reason was the new gospel, where men in powdered wigs spoke of liberty and rights, the news was met with shock. How could this happen here, now, in the age of enlightenment? Pamphlets were printed, questions were asked in salons and coffee houses. The death of Anna Göldi became an embarrassment, a stain on the map of a modern Europe that prided itself on having left the darkness behind. Decades passed, the weeds grew and died over her forgotten grave. Then slowly, the ground shifted, not the soil, but the soil of memory. Scholars and historians began to dig, not with shovels, but with paper and ink. They sifted through the brittle pages of court records. They read the testimonies, weighed the evidence, and in the light of reason, the truth emerged. The needles could have been placed by anyone or never been there at all. The child's illness matched conditions that science would one day name and treat. The confession, Anna's supposed admission of witchcraft, was not truth, but the product of fear, isolation, and the exhaustion of a woman cornered. Anna Göldi had been no witch, only inconvenient. In time, Glarus bowed its head to the truth. The town acknowledged its sin. Monuments were raised, not to erase the shame, but to face it. Her name, once buried in silence, was spoken aloud again, not as a curse, but as a warning, because Anna Göldi was the last to die by law for a crime that never existed. The final ember of 3 centuries of fire, extinguished not by mercy, but by the swift, cold kiss of a blade. Her story is not just history, it is a mirror. It shows how easily fear can survive the death of superstition, how law can wrap itself in righteousness while carrying the weight of murder, how silence, ours, yours, mine, can be the sharpest weapon of all. She is gone. The mountains that watched her last breath still stand, their peaks cutting the sky, their shadows stretching long over the town that killed her. And in the cold air of the Alps, the question remains, when the next Anna stands accused, will we speak for her, or will we too watch the blade fall?